Hello, my name is Talip Küçükcan. I welcome you on behalf of the TRD World Forum Digital Debates. Now we are going to continue our debates on the new dynamics in the global order. That is a monthly debate. Today we will be talking about Brexit. The title of our discussion will be After Brexit, the End of the EU. Of course, at the end of it, there is a question mark. I have got two excellent speakers today who joins us. I would like to thank both of them. Let me introduce them to you first, then we will start talking. They have got long and impressive CVs. I'll shorten them with their permission. Dr. László Andor, who is the Secretary General of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. He is an economist and also a former EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion between 2010 and 2014. Since stepping down from the Commission, he became head of the Department of Economic Policy at Cornelius University in Budapest. He is a senior fellow at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin and a visiting professor at Brussels, and also he is also visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris. So he has different interests, but of course he's very much specialized in the European affairs, and he had some other positions in the university. So he has a PhD and MA degrees, MA from the University of Manchester in UK, and he has a PhD from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in 1995. Thank you very much, Dr. Andor, for joining us. Let me introduce also very briefly Dr. Mark Garnett, who is a senior fellow in politics at Lancaster University. He is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Lancaster since 2006. Before, he taught politics at several other universities, including Leicester, Bristol, and Exeter. His main research interests are the interplay between political ideas, personalities, institutions, and events. Actually, he has written two books. One of them is From Anger to Apathy, The British Experience, which was published by Jonathan Cape in 2007. And he also authored Conservative Thinkers with Kevin Higston. It was published by Manchester University in 2009. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. We are going to look at a contested and controversial issue today, that is the Brexit and what happens afterwards. My first question to Dr. Andor. There has been a debate about the future of EU after the Brexit, whether this will set some sort of example for other countries, and of course, EU response. In your opinion, Dr. Andor, is the EU in a stronger or weaker position in the post-Brexit period, and why is that so?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and it's a very interesting debate. I believe the European Union, as well as the United Kingdom, have become weaker as a result of Brexit. Ever since this discussion emerged, and especially since the referendum in the UK in 2016, the dominant opinion on the continent was that Brexit would make both the EU and the UK weaker, at least economically. And this is probably the case. And there isn't much to do against this, since the disruption of traditional trading relations inevitably results in a kind of adjustment period or a transition period when certain parts of the economies on both sides, which have been most affected by the disruption of frictionless trade, will need to adjust. And this is going to take some time, probably. At the same time, on the EU side, I should add that perhaps with the departure of the UK, there is a higher degree of political cohesion. Since the United Kingdom, for very long, at least since the early 1990s, was a reluctant participant of the integration, gained opt-out, stayed away from various aspects of the integration, and within the remaining EU, we might observe a higher degree of cohesion and will to deepen the integration, especially in the face of such adversity like the COVID-19 crisis.
Well, I think that's a very short but very precise introduction. If you're finished, I just would like to go on with Dr. Garnett, because sometimes there is a little bit of connection problems. I don't know whether you have finished, Dr. Andor. Did you finish your first and initial observation? Okay, that's fine. Okay, thank you. Dr. Garnett, do you agree with Mr. Andor? Because he said that I think two sides have, some sort of weakening process have started for EU side and for the British side as well. What would be your comment on this observation?
Well, my expert knowledge isn't of the EU, but I would, from as far as I know, I would agree with absolutely everything that Dr. Andor said. From my perspective, that it may well be an economic blow to the European Union to some extent, but politically it might even be helpful because of Britain having been such an obstructive member of the European Union for so long. And that situation really, I don't think, was ever going to change. I think that Britain was always going to be opting out and objecting, and more than anything, it was just a disruptive influence because British politicians, even if they reached agreement with their partners, would always come home and brief the media that there had been a terrible row and that Britain had won the argument. That kind of thing just wasn't healthy. We weren't a healthy member of the European Union. But in terms of Britain, economically, we still don't really know because of the COVID pandemic. I think that has partly disguised the economic repercussions. We can already see some signs of companies leaving Britain. There's a great logic to particularly American companies which were located in Britain because of access to the single market. There's a certain logic to these companies thinking about moving, but we still don't really know, and this will take a little bit of time. But politically, the Brexit effect has been, I think, to damage Britain's reputation internationally, not just because it's now a weaker player because it isn't in the European Union, but also because of its behavior. I think that certainly this present government has shown a willingness to break international law, maybe not in particularly important ways, but still Britain, I think, crucially depends on a reputation for obeying international law, for upholding international law. So even if it's threatening to disobey international law, that is a blow to the reputation that it has tried to uphold. So I think internationally, and America, I think the US will regard Britain as a less valuable ally because we can no longer be seen as America's voice in the councils of the European Union. And so just generally, I think across the board, I think this has been a blow to our international reputation. But I think internally, the biggest effect is to bring into question the future of our United Kingdom. That it's certainly a very strong argument for those who want Scottish independence, the idea that Britain, that when Scotland had a referendum on the continued membership of the United Kingdom in 2014, a promise was made really to the Scottish voters that the only way to be sure of staying in the European Union was staying in the United Kingdom. Well, just 2 years later, that promise turned to dust. And although there is no clear margin of advantage for those who want independence in Scotland, there certainly is, if there is another vote on independence, it's certainly going to be even closer than last time, and almost certainly at the moment it looks like Scotland would vote for independence. Also, strain in Northern Ireland, the call for a united Ireland has grown stronger because Northern Ireland voted against Brexit. And even in Wales, which is normally seen as being a very reliable partner of England, even there, certain elements of Welsh society are now thinking that they would be better off outside the United Kingdom. So all these things have really damaged Britain, but this is such a contentious issue. And of course, one party has greatly benefited from Brexit, and that is the Conservative Party. And so you might say that the government during this pandemic has made many mistakes, but actually Brexit has helped it because there are some people in the country who, even if they don't like being locked down, have their freedoms restricted, in the end they come back to this point that the government in office now was the government which ensured Brexit. So although there are lots of problems down the line for the Conservative Party, at the moment you could say that one result is to strengthen the Conservative Party, weaken the opposition parties, but to certainly weaken Britain economically and politically.
I think I can only agree with this, and at the same time, let me just highlight that a lot of commentators suggested that this, let's call it episode, the developments and the outcome of the referendum was a kind of break with the tradition of British pragmatism. That foreign policy in the UK was supposed to be famously pragmatic. And somehow these developments derailed a general approach which was always carefully measuring costs and benefits, and somehow, let's say, the imaginary benefits of Brexit overtook the very real costs and the very real loss of influence, because in a way, yes, the UK is regaining control. Yes, in a way, the control of the UK borders is becoming more real than in the past. At the same time, the UK is losing influence over the largest market on which the UK economy remains dependent. And since, if I'm not mistaken, about 40% of export-import is still going to the continent, the remaining 27 countries of the European Union, obviously, for much of the British players, business enterprises, this remains a reference point for alignment. And instead of participating in rule making, the UK economy is becoming a kind of rule taker. And, of course, what kind of calculations about the development of the global economy might have been behind, we don't know exactly, because we heard very often this slogan of global Britain. But obviously, the global economy is very different than it was, 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, or just 25 years ago. And the European nations, or even the European nations together with the United States, can control and influence much less in the global economy than in the past. So one way or another, the UK business would still need to align itself on its largest markets, as opposed to controlling, which was the driving idea behind the Leave campaign.
Well, thank you. I just came back. I had a little bit disconnection. Sorry for that, gentlemen. Dr. Garnett, you were talking about the economic impact of the Brexit. You just, I think, mentioned a few things about the US companies maybe moving UK. But what other areas that you can explore, especially the economic impact of the Brexit?
Well, the main concern for British politicians has been the financial sector, the services sector, based particularly in the City of London. And this has not been protected by any agreement with the EU as yet, by the deal, the rather thin deal that was negotiated for the relationship prior to Britain's departure. And again, here the signals are quite mixed, but logically it would seem that moving to European capitals, perhaps to Amsterdam, Frankfurt, wherever, that would seem to be quite logical if you're thinking that one advantage will be being able to deal in the euro rather than the pound sterling, which at one time was, of course, the world's leading currency, but that time is an awful long time ago now. And so, again, there have been stories of people relocating to the mainland. And the one point about this, I think, which is perhaps an advantage again to the Conservative Party with its rhetoric, is that the City of London has really been too powerful in British life for certainly since the Thatcher years. And so the idea, the rhetoric, which is really, I guess, more similar to the kind of rhetoric you would have got from a Labour government at one time, is that with the help of the government, we will rebuild our manufacturing industry. And so if the financial sector actually leaves Britain, then that might be an advantage. Might also be an advantage that prices of living in London might fall. It might become a less attractive place to live for some people who we don't really want to have living in London, who've come over perhaps with money that they haven't acquired legally. And so you can see how at the moment all of the rhetorical game is still in the Conservative Party's hands. And you also have to remember there were the most frightening predictions of an immediate crash for the British economy. Straight after the referendum, the people on the Remain side really didn't have very many arguments to use apart from fear. And they said that there would be an economic disaster. And although you might say the disaster may well be happening, but slowly, the people on the Brexiteer side already are saying these predictions were far too exaggerated. And so when things do get very much worse, which they will, then there will still be the people fighting the battles of the referendum and saying that the predictions didn't come true and that we have got back control. Again, this is really almost like a religious feeling there is in this country, and it very much has its roots in the Second World War and illusions about the Second World War. The people on the Brexit side tend to think that Britain won the Second World War on its own, that America came in just as we were winning. The Russians, they wouldn't even know that the Soviet Union was fighting for most of the war on the side of Britain. And so a kind of an idea has built that Britain's decline has not been inevitable. It has been almost the product of people who didn't believe enough in Britain, that there were a lot of negative. So you can see that this is all mythology and ideology. And the worry would be, I would think, that Britain faces all of these terrible economic consequences, but doesn't really learn its lesson because the religious feeling of Brexit is still there. And what will happen is, first of all, the kind of anger against the European Union, which we're seeing at the moment over the supply of vaccines, that kind of thing might well grow, but also some kind of really bad friction within the country, not just between Scotland and England, Wales and England, Northern Ireland and England, but also just between Brexiteers and Remainers, because it is very much a kind of a generational war that we have in this country. So you can see that almost the pandemic, in its strange way, has kept the lid on what could be a very explosive situation down the line.
Well, thank you. Sure, Dr. Andor, go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to add a point because indeed a kind of sectoral analysis is helpful at this point. In my view, there have been in EU-UK relations, let's say, three outstanding sectors where the UK has been enjoying a competitive advantage. Finance has been mentioned, science is another one, and defense is a third one. And in my view, if you compare these, defense is probably the one which is not really under threat, at least in the short and the medium term. On the other hand, in terms of finance, indeed, we have already witnessed a shift of activities away from London. I think for a very long time, everybody assumed that London's position as not only a European, but a global financial center cannot be under threat. And now, despite all these assumptions, we are witnessing a shift of activities, as we heard, towards Dublin, Amsterdam, Paris, Frankfurt, especially. On science, I think the point is that, of course, this has been built up through centuries. And obviously, other countries would need centuries to invest in science capacities and increase their competitiveness. At the same time, in the recent decades, we also have seen that in UK science, continental citizens, scientists, doctors, researchers coming from other countries of the European Union have been playing an increasing role. So in a way, as a post-Brexit strategy for the UK to keep this advantage, they need to keep the UK very attractive and friendly to these continental citizens. Otherwise, some of them might just change their mind and find, continental universities and research centers more attractive than the British locations.
I think that's a good reminder, because I was going to raise that issue, especially R&D issue, research and development, because Dr. Garnett is a member of the university. He's been teaching, and I think he's been observing the foreign and European, researchers in his universities. I think this is one of the issues. Some people argue that the UK might lose a talented, a number of people to their countries. There will be brain drain in a sense. What would be your response to that, Dr. Garnett?
Well, I obviously, some of my colleagues at this university, at Lancaster University, have noticed that although the university is a place where they're more than welcome, that there has been a bit of a change in the mood in the country outside the university since the referendum result. However, I would say that my experience may be slightly unusual, because we live in a part of the world where people don't really want to leave very much. But you can certainly see where people who've experienced hostility will think that one of the big reasons for coming to Britain has gone, and might well think of departing. I think the more important loss for Britain will be that people who were thinking of coming here will now almost certainly be thinking more than once about this. They might in fact change their minds. So we may keep and the other thing, of course, is that the scientists, the people who, for example, have helped to create the AstraZeneca vaccine at Oxford, that those are people who depend on research grants, might well find that in Britain, although the government will almost certainly try to plug the gap in European funding, whether in fact they'll feel confident that their activities will go on being financed properly. So you might find scientists are inclined to go over to the mainland to leave Britain, but I would, as I say, I think the worst thing is that we've become a much less attractive place, really, for people not just from Europe. I think just generally there has been a tide of nationalism in England, which makes England just in theory a much less attractive place, and I think in practice it has become a less tolerant place than before.
Okay, let me turn to Dr. Andor on this issue. Actually, now you raised the issue of rising xenophobia, racism, but there is a general, I think, rise of populism in the world, including many European Union countries, as we see the attitudes towards migrants and refugees. How do you think, Dr. Andor, that will play out in the next years to come, especially in the European Union countries, when it comes to dealing with the rise of populism? Because that is one of the biggest danger to, I think, contemporary democracy in the world, not only in Europe, but elsewhere as well. Since you've been involved in the EU affairs for a long time, what would be your views, observations, and maybe predictions for the future?
This is an absolutely important question, and I agree with you. We cannot single out individual countries, because there might be an international trend here. The weakening of democracies, the weakening of commitments to human rights, and the rule of law, questioning a lot of principles of the Enlightenment, which have been perhaps taken for granted, at least in the post-war era. And now the various political forces trying to sideline these general principles of politics and public life, sometimes threatening the freedom of press, gender equality, and other principles which in Europe have been at least dominant, maybe not overwhelming all the time. And indeed, this is a crucial question. to what extent this kind of regression can take hold. My observation from the last 10 years at least is that in many ways there are certainly economic roots, drivers, factors behind these tendencies. And the discontent with some of the mainstream political parties is linked to policy failure and the lack of capacity to maintain reasonable, good economic performance, close to full employment, good opportunities for living and working conditions to develop. And when people experience a too long period of economic as well as social crisis, there might be a tendency to turn to political forces which offer simple solutions, but the simple solutions might as well be fake. And let's be honest, this is not only European. We have seen this playing out in the United States of America as well. And indeed, the destabilization of democratic norms might be indeed a serious question. I wouldn't say that every single EU country is out of the danger zone in this respect. In some countries, there's been a serious weakening of the rule of law. In other countries, what we can easily consider post-fascist parties or extremist parties, or some call it the hard right. I mean, these are not identical concepts, but similarly threatening established political structures might be quite strong, coming close to power, and threatening not only the individual national context of politics and constitutional systems, but also the European integration. And that's where obviously the concerns can come about domino effects and a general Euroscepticism breaking through and resulting in a disintegration instead of a deepening of a European integration.
Well, I think, as you have just said, the challenge is a common one. I mean, all countries face such challenges. And I think COVID-19 is yet another global challenge that we see that requires international cooperation. Dr. Garnett, how do you see this COVID-19 playing out as far as the relations between the EU and UK is concerned? Because, as I said, I mean, unless there is a global response to this issue, it will be very difficult to overcome the crisis, at least in the near future, because the trade, travel, and exchanges will continue. But this has, just stopped it, reduced it. How do you see, COVID-19 as a factor in the relationship between the EU and the Brexit? EU and UK.
Well, at the moment, of course, our press is very full of headlines about the vaccine, and it's certainly. I think this is the immediate problem arising from COVID is that the British obviously negotiated a different deal with AstraZeneca from the EU's deal, and this has proven to be almost the only decision which the British have taken since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in 2019. Almost the only decision which has worked well, has seemingly worked spectacularly well, and that the main victim of this success has been the European Union. And as I was saying before, when Britain was a member of the European Union, there were many occasions when politicians would boast that they had secured a victory over the European Union. And very often, of course, that was fake news or an exaggeration. Well, strangely, it might seem that Britain's greatest victory over the European Union has occurred after it's left the European Union. And certainly in this country, what is really a commercial dispute between the European Union and the producer of this vaccine is being presented as the European Union not being able to forgive Britain for having left. And so it's certainly made our Prime Minister continues to talk about our EU friends, but there are other parts of his rhetoric which are very populist. For example, just yesterday, because there is regrettably a rising tide of the virus at the moment on the European continent, and this is associated with a variant of the virus which has originated in the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, just openly said there is a good chance that a new wave of this virus will wash up on our shores. And that is implying, of course, that a virus variant which originated in the United Kingdom is actually the product of the nasty continent once again. But also the problem here is of migrants who arrive on the shores of Britain, and the popular rhetoric again is that the European Union allows people to arrive on Britain's shores because they don't want to have the problem of all these migrants. So you can see how all of these themes are being intertwined in this populist Prime Minister, just bluntly trying to make people to associate the new wave of the virus, first of all with the European Union, but secondly with migrants with arriving on our shores. So again, COVID is certainly has not put the brake on populism in our country. We have our flag always now is visible whenever any government minister is interviewed, very much like America, very much like perhaps other countries with different types of regimes for our liberal democracy. The Union flag is always on display, and this is all trying again to say, if you criticize the government, you are not patriotic. This is exactly what happened in America. We have our own Anglo-Saxon version of this particular political virus, and it's certainly taking hold here, and it's being it's continuing to poison relations with the European Union. And we all think the sooner that this virus is over, the better. But certainly from the point of view of anything like a return to an amicable, a friendly but more distant relationship with the EU, that's got to wait until this vaccine is rolled out. In the meantime, all the promises that developing countries would get their fair share of the vaccine, all the promises that AstraZeneca was making the vaccine at really a very low cost so that it could be rolled out to other countries, they all seem to have been forgotten in the vaccine war, which is between the developed nations of Europe, America, and elsewhere.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I just would like to get Dr. Andor's views on the vaccination issue, that debate. There's a controversy and how this will influence the relationship in particular, but in general, how do you think the relations between UK and EU will develop from the perspectives of European leadership? If you can combine the two together, and maybe we can have some reflections on that. Generally, the relations, the future of the relations, and particularly, as Mark Garnett has just said, there are lots of issues regarding the vaccination as well.
My feeling is that those who want to find a conflict, they will always find one. Last year, it was the fish. Now it's the vaccine. Maybe next year, it will be something else if the vaccine question is solved. So I think the general orientation would need to change to seek cooperation despite the separation, instead of seeking opportunities to blame each other, or blame governance failure on one side to the other side. The blunder in Brussels regarding the vaccine is beyond any doubt, and I think it's quite easy to explain, because last spring and summer, I believe the decision makers, and not only the Eurocrats but also the heads of state and government, wanted to use the European Union, which it can do well in normal times, which is to keep prices down. So they were focusing on the price instead of focusing on the speed and the volume. And now when we are facing the pandemic, clearly the focus should have been on the speed and the volume instead of the price. It would be still a good deal to pay more if a large amount of vaccines could have come earlier to the European Union member states. And surely, there is a lot to correct on this in the coming months, while it is also true that in quite a few countries, there are stocks of vaccines without the implementation capacity of the distribution and the vaccination. But clearly, the EU countries are behind, and they would need to catch up. The point which I would like to add is that despite this blunder, it seems that the logic which drove the 27 EU countries into this coordination effort has not become less popular. What do I mean by this? I mean that last spring the EU countries looked around and saw healthcare as a policy field where the integration has been very shallow. Not too many competences given to the European Union so far, but now they saw that because of the pandemic, crisis response, distribution of capacities, dealing with imbalances between the countries, standardization of health services. There are quite a long list of opportunities where the integration could bring benefits. So if they correct the vaccine issue now, I think they can still save the idea of the so-called health union and taking advantage of further cooperation and coordination possibilities for the benefit of all the 27.
Well, I think that's a good, explanation of the case. Now, Mark, I would like to come back to you, but this is maybe more UK domestic issue. That is the Northern Ireland issue. There are lots of unanswered questions when it comes to the Brexit issue. What will happen to Northern Ireland and how it will be managed by the government? How do you think Boris Johnson will lead the issues with regard to Northern Ireland?
Well, so far he seems to again be using the European Union as an excuse, as a kind of a scapegoat for his decisions. I mean, the basis of this problem is that during the referendum campaign, only people from the Remain campaign actually thought about Northern Ireland at all. The people on the Brexit side were really, they didn't visit Northern Ireland, they didn't talk about Northern Ireland. There was, of course, a separate campaign in Northern Ireland, and it was divided very much on the usual nationalist, unionist lines. But the practical implications were not thought about because it was not really expected that the Brexiteers would win. I think most moderate Brexiteers thought that it would be a great result to come close to winning, and that would kind of validate Britain being a really noisy, awkward, obstructive partner. So, in other words, the Brexiteers have been confronted with the result of their own victory, and really there is no solution. There is no clean solution when you have the Good Friday Agreement in place, that there should not be any kind of hard border across the island of Ireland. The idea that the hard border is somehow kind of in the Irish Sea between Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom means that Northern Ireland is treated as almost an integral part of a united Ireland. So given all the political and the geographical factors at play, there is no proper solution. The only thing that you can hope is that both sides will kind of pretend the border isn't there and that the checks would not happen, the customs checks, etc. And obviously the European Union wants to preserve the integrity of the single market. And that means that what Boris Johnson is thinking, I guess, is that if any kind of border apparatus really re-emerges on the island of Ireland, it'll be the European Union which has created this, and therefore he can blame any resulting trouble on the European Union. Well, that was perhaps his game plan before Joe Biden became US president. It seems that Joe Biden has already issued instructions, or people in his entourage has issued instructions to both sides. But the trouble is, what he can't really do is tell them to come to a logical solution, because there isn't a logical solution, except for perhaps Britain rejoining the customs union, which I'm afraid Boris Johnson would not be able to do, given that he's a prisoner of his own, the position he decided to adopt of being pro-Brexit in the 2016 referendum. And so, you know, really, it's something which is Northern Ireland politics are very rarely covered in the London newspapers, but any re-emergence of violence, and obviously that would bring a political crisis to the whole of Britain. So it's another of these problems where the policymakers obviously are hoping that people's attention is on COVID and that there can be some kind of amicable compromise. But as I say, I just do not see any way, given the political forces and geography. I can't really see anything other than something of almost a conceding of their case by one side or the other. I would argue that almost certainly it will end up being the British, because in this particular situation, especially with the Northern Irish population which voted for Brexit, I think that the British would have to find some kind of face-saving solution to make it look like they've stood up for the integrity of the Union, but in fact they will have probably accepted terms which are more acceptable to the European Union.
Dr. Andor, do you think EU is prepared to make any contribution to the solution of this issue, or to bring some original ideas on the table to help UK?
Well, I believe the European Union needs to keep calm on this question. There are internal matters of the United Kingdom, and that should be obviously between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to be discussed.
Right, okay. Now, I just would like to raise a foreign policy issue with regard to EU, because there are many other challenges in other parts of the world. And sometimes EU is criticized for not having a single and powerful foreign policy. Now, UK is out as a very influential, I think, actor in the world politics, in the Mediterranean, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia. UK was an important, I think, actor. Now, EU has lost that actor. How do you think EU, how well it is prepared to face up with the challenges emerging in different parts of the world?
If I can start on this question, I would say that the internal rules of the European Union represent indeed the hindering factor, because unanimity still is required in foreign policy decisions in the European Union, even if it has now a high representative and always coming into international debates, occasionally conflicts, with an intention to be a benevolent force and spreading the European values and principles. So until the EU can shift to what is called the qualified majority rule for the decision making here, I think there will be a break on the international or even global role of the EU. The EU would need to reflect also on the international role of the single currency, the euro, and how the euro could play a greater role in the international trade and finance. That's another key to this question. And I believe much of these issues are going to be discussed in the so-called Conference on the Future of Europe, which will be launched in May. Originally, the idea was to launch a conference with the citizens of Europe about the future of the EU last May, but because of the COVID crisis, it has been postponed. But it will take place. And I think such questions of shifting towards greater EU-level competencies, including in defense and foreign affairs, will be discussed, and then we will see where this debate can move in 1 or 2 years' time.
Well, thank you. Dr. Garnett, Scotland is another case when it comes to, I think, UK affairs and also the post-Brexit developments. Do you think that there will be a move in Scotland towards independence? Because there was referendum before, but majority of the people did not vote for an independent Scotland. What is your prediction for the near future?
Well, I mentioned this very briefly earlier. My prediction for the immediate future is that the Prime Minister will try his best not to concede a referendum to Scotland. He says, even today in the House of Commons, he was saying that the referendum of 2014 was supposed to be once in a generation, and therefore there shouldn't be a referendum perhaps 20 years. There are elections in May, the elections for the Scottish Parliament. I don't know how widely known outside Britain this is, but the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has just been enduring a political crisis where some people on the opposition parties were wanting her to resign. There was a motion of no confidence in the First Minister. Now she is obviously the spearhead of the campaign for an independent Scotland at the moment. So any bad news for her was bad news for the cause of independence. So I think at the moment everyone is waiting to see what will happen in the elections, whether this scandal has damaged Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish National Party. If the Scottish National Party, the electoral system is designed really to stop the Scottish National Party getting a majority in the Parliament. But if that fails and the Scottish National Party do get a majority in the Parliament, then I think it's going to be impossible for Boris Johnson to avoid his predecessor but one, David Cameron, conceded the idea of a referendum. I think the problem for the British government is that, as I mentioned before, there was a promise in 2014 that if you voted to stay in the Union, you would stay in the European Union as well as the United Kingdom, whereas if you voted for independence, there was a very low likelihood that Scotland would be admitted to the European Union. Now, I think in a way it's still questionable whether Scotland would be admitted to the EU in the near future, but certainly the other part of this promise to the Scottish people has been crushed by the very party who oversaw the referendum in 2014. So the prediction about it's a volatile situation. There is an undercurrent of support for independence, which I think is irreducible to below, let's say, 46-47%. In other words, there's already a bedrock of support for independence, which will mean that the verdict can only be close, even if it is still a victory for the maintenance of the Union. I think more likely that Scottish people are now very tired. We have, after all, a Prime Minister who is even though he is a kind of exotic background, he does seem to be a very English type of person and went to a very privileged English school. Whenever he goes to Scotland, the case for independence gets a very large boost. So I would have thought that if there's a campaign with him as Prime Minister, there is every chance that Scotland will vote for independence. But clearly, it's an extremely complicated. Things like the currency would have to be sorted out. Defence arrangements. Britain's nuclear deterrent is based in Scotland. So it's an incredibly complicated matter. But once again, there is, just as in Britain, on the side of the Brexiteers, this is about passion just as much as it is about logic. And I don't think that the case for the Union anymore enjoys the passionate support that maybe it did even 5 years ago, whereas the case for independent Scotland, it always enjoys nostalgic, emotional support. So the British Prime Minister has got numerous crises going on at once. This is one which he really does need, and the government itself has move to try to do something about this. This is partly why they fly the Union flag at absolutely every available opportunity. Nobody's fooled by this. A majority of English Conservatives want Scotland to leave the Union. However, the rhetoric of the Union is such that Boris Johnson does not want to be the Prime Minister who presides over the fragmentation of the United Kingdom. All the chances are, however, that he will leave it one way or another in a much more fragile state than when he found it.
Well, thank you. That's a very, I think, detailed reply to our question. Dr. Andor, the future of alliances depends most of the time on the leadership of the, members of this alliance. And EU as an alliance, EU as a, let's say, union, also needs that leadership. And until now, I think Germany was one of the strong countries, and Merkel, she was very pro-European Union. I think she tried to consolidate the place of the EU in the world politics and also in Europe as well. By the end of this year, I think it's in September, she will leave the office and Germany will elect somebody else. How do you think the departure of Angela Merkel will impact the future of EU? What is your expectation?
Well, first of all, I would like to say I very much agree with you that for a very long period, indeed, Angela Merkel has been the most influential politician in the European Union. Of course, she has been a Chancellor of Germany, not having an explicit EU role, but informal influence, a kind of leadership behavior in European Council meetings, obviously, is something which we have to be aware of, and especially at the time of the Euro area crisis, various crisis response strategies, herself and her government have been indeed, at least informally, in a kind of driving seat. Nevertheless, I would say that it's not so much a single person. I think it is Germany as such, which is the strongest, largest country of the European Union, and especially the Euro area, in which there might have been historically, divergent opinions and sometimes hesitations about, deepening the union and deepening the EMU, the Economic and Monetary Union in particular. Now, especially in response to the COVID-19 recession, I think there has been a convergence among political forces. CDU, the party of Madame Merkel, actually elected a so-called continuity candidate for leading the center-right in Germany, which provides some kind of stability to the foreign policy approach of Germany and the European policy approach of Germany as well. And since for too long the center-right was in a grand coalition with the center-left, there is also a kind of amalgam of European policies which they have been sharing, and either of the two will remain in government, right? So the grand coalition is probably over this year, but either the CDU or this SPD, the Social Democrats, will remain in government. So I would not expect a kind of U-turn or a kind of major twist in the European policy of Germany. Hence, the stability is a most likely scenario. Nevertheless, it's always true before German elections or elections in major countries, the decision-making in Brussels slows down, and people wait until a new government emerges in Berlin with a fresh mandate, which will be able to provide political endorsement and weight to the new initiatives.
Well, I think you are optimistic about the future of EU from the German side. Now, my last question to you, Dr. Garnett. We have not talked about the impact of Brexit on UK foreign policy. Now, there is some debate that the UK will follow the US suit and its foreign policy will tilt towards the South Pacific. Do you think that will take place? And if that takes place, how it will play out in the coming months and years?
Yeah, well, Dr. Andor used the phrase before, global Britain. It's a lovely sounding slogan. So far, the launch of global Britain has not been glorious. And certainly the trade deals that Britain has managed to sign tend to be very similar or perhaps slightly less advantageous than the deals that we enjoyed when we were a member of the European Union. In particular, the trade deal with Japan is one which seems to involve the kind of surrender of sovereignty, which Brexiteers get upset about when we have to make those surrenders, as we call it, to the European Union. But I think beyond that, we've still got the dilemma which under the coalition government, the Cameron government, from 2010 to 2015, there was definitely a British tilt towards China going on. Then global Britain wasn't invented by our current Prime Minister. It's been going for a little while. But of course, this means this terrible kind of almost a choice between China and the United States is looming for Britain. And there are noises at the moment in the British government that our current Prime Minister is too sympathetic towards China, is constantly being reminded by his backbenchers of human rights abuses alleged in or proven in China. Elsewhere, of course, with nations of the former empire, of the Commonwealth, countries like India, it doesn't seem that Britain has had the kind of reception that the Brexiteers thought. I think the Brexiteers rather thought that India would be falling over itself in order to get a very lucrative trade deal with Britain. But of course, India is now a major emerging power and it's got its own agenda. So in other words, the Brexit really has, in some ways, presented an opportunity for Britain to think about its identity and its role in the world. The problem is that, well, it doesn't want to have that kind of discussion because it's frightened of what it would find. I said before, Britain has been in denial of fairly inevitable trends which set in really at the beginning of the 20th century, more than 100 years ago, still hasn't got used to not being a major player who can pick and choose its alliances throughout the world. Our politicians have never tried to explain to the public the realities of the situation facing Britain. As a result, Britain has made an awful lot of foreign policy mistakes in the quest for a kind of a prominent world role, which is no longer really a rational thing to aspire to. So in other words, it's another moment, just like the Suez crisis of 1956, where the British should have had a proper debate about their place in the world. They missed the opportunity then because they were frightened of what would come out. No prime minister wants to be the prime minister who tells the British public, we're not any longer a great power. We are a very significant second-ranking power, and we should be glad with that, and we should work with that. Instead, there's always a hankering after a great role in the world, and as a result, the opportunity for a debate about our position will pass, and I would imagine we'll go to our default position, which is in foreign policy to take our dictation from Washington, from the United States.
Well, I think, thank you very much, gentlemen. With that, we come to the end of our program. Dr. Andor and Dr. Garnett, thank you very much for joining us. And we really appreciate your insights on the Brexit issue and its impact on EU and also UK. Thank you very much for joining us. And we would like to say goodbye to everyone. Goodbye from TRT World Forum Digital Debates.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.